Two of them kidnapped and murdered a 2-year-old boy. Another murdered his own teacher in front of an entire classroom. And another was caught while searching for his third victim. When we think of murder, we often picture adult criminals. But some of the most shocking cases in British history were actually committed by children and teenagers. In this video, we're looking at 10 of the youngest known killers in the UK, from cases that horrified entire communities to crimes so disturbing they're still talked about decades later. These are the stories of the UK's youngest killers. We'll begin with what is perhaps the most infamous case on this list, and one that continues to shock people more than 30 years later. On the 12th of February 1993, 25-year-old Denise Fergus was shopping at the New Strand shopping centre in Merseyside with her 2-year-old son, James Bulger. While in the butcher's, Denise briefly let go of James's hand to open her purse and pay for an item. It was only a matter of seconds, but when she turned around, James was gone. That same day, two 10-year-old boys, Robert Thompson and John Venables, had skipped school and were wandering around the shopping centre. They spotted James, took him by the hand and led him away. Over the next few hours, the boys led James further and further away from the shopping centre. They took him to Leeds and Liverpool Canal, where James suffered facial injuries after being dropped on his head. The pair reportedly joked about pushing him into the water before continuing towards a railway line around 2.5 miles away from the shopping centre. One of the most disturbing aspects of this case is that Thompson and Venables were seen with James by dozens of people during that journey, 38 people in total. Some questioned them, but Thompson and Venables claimed James was their younger brother, or that they had simply found him and were taking him to the police station. Despite James being visibly upset, those excuses were apparently enough to avoid suspicion, and James remained in their company. Eventually, they reached the railway line. There, the boys tortured the 2-year-old. They threw blue paint into James's eyes, kicked him and stamped on him, before dropping a railway fish plate weighing around 22 pounds onto James, causing multiple fractures to his skull. Afterwards, they laid his body across the railway tracks in an attempt to make his death appear accidental. Sometime after they left, a train passed over the tracks and severed James's body. 2 days later, his body was discovered by 4 boys searching for footballs nearby. A post-mortem examination found that James had suffered 42 separate injuries and had died before being struck by the train. As police searched for those responsible, CCTV footage showing James being led away from the shopping centre was released to the public. The footage quickly became one of the most recognisable CCTV images in British history. After seeing it, a woman recognised John Venables and contacted police. Her information led investigators directly to the 2 boys, and paint matching the blue paint used during the attack was also found on their clothing, helping link them to the murder. At trial, Robert and John were referred to as Child A and Child B because of their ages. At just 10 years old, both were found guilty of murder and sentenced to detention at Her Majesty's pleasure. They each received a minimum term of 8 years before becoming eligible for parole. During sentencing, the judge told them, "In my judgment, your conduct was both cunning and very wicked." In 2001, both were released on life licence, given new identities, and granted lifelong anonymity. But the years that followed saw their lives take very different paths. Robert Thompson is not known to have committed any further offences since his release, and now lives under a different name. John Venables, however, was recalled to prison in 2010 after indecent images of children were found on his computer. He was later released, but returned to prison again in 2017 after further images of children were discovered. Parole boards have repeatedly concluded that John continues to pose a risk to children, and applications for his release were rejected in both 2020 and 2023, but it's reported that he is currently being reconsidered for release. Our next case is that of Daniel Bartlam, a teenager whose obsession with fictional crime stories would later earn him the nickname the Coronation Street Killer. On the 25th of April 2011, emergency services were called to a house in Nottingham after a fire broke out in an upstairs bedroom. 14-year-old Daniel Bartlam appeared to be a hero. He told police he got up in the night to go to the toilet and was confronted by a masked intruder who threw a hammer at him before fleeing. He claimed to have then bravely rushed into the smoke-filled room to rescue his 6-year-old brother, who had been sleeping by his mum inside. Daniel then claimed that he returned to save the family dog. Inside the bedroom, firefighters discovered the body of Daniel's 47-year-old mum, Jacqueline Bartlam. At first, Daniel told police that a masked intruder was responsible, but it didn't take long for investigators to uncover the truth. A post-mortem examination revealed that Jacqueline had not died in the fire. She had been struck over the head 7 times with a claw hammer before the blaze was even started. As detectives continued questioning Daniel, his story began to change. Eventually, he admitted to killing his mum. He claimed that he had suddenly lost control following an argument about a pair of missing trainers, in which his mum allegedly called him a freak. But it was discovered that Jacqueline had actually been attacked in her sleep. The fire had caused such extensive damage that Jacqueline later had to be identified through dental records. But what shocked investigators even further was that evidence confirmed the murder had actually been planned. Police recovered a deleted 9-page story from Daniel's computer. The fictional plot featured a character named Daniel Bartlam carrying out the perfect murder in which he murders his mum, also named Jacqueline, in the same circumstances as this incident. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Investigators also discovered that Daniel had become fascinated with violent storylines from television dramas, including Hollyoaks, Emmerdale, and Coronation Street, saving the storylines on his computer. One particular Coronation Street storyline featured the character John Stape killing a woman with a hammer. The similarities between this fictional storyline and reality would later lead the media to nickname Daniel the Coronation Street Killer. Police had also found evidence that Daniel had searched online for phrases such as how to get away with murder and how people get away with murder in shows. As more details emerged, family members described a noticeable change in Daniel's behaviour before the murder. His stepfather told the court that Daniel had become increasingly strange and withdrawn, even urinating in boxes in his own bedroom rather than using the bathroom. Throughout the investigation, Daniel attempted to portray Jacqueline as a bad mother. However, her parents strongly rejected those claims, saying she adored her children and she would do anything for them. During the trial, prosecutors argued that the boundaries between fiction and reality had become tragically blurred for Daniel. The judge described the murder as grotesque and senseless and concluded that Daniel appeared to have wanted to commit and get away with the perfect murder. At just 14 years old, Daniel Bartlam was found guilty of the murder of his mum. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 16 years. More than a decade later, reports emerged that Daniel had been moved to an open prison in January 2024, meaning he may be just one step closer to eventual release. Our next case is that of Kim Edwards and Lucas Markham, who became the youngest double murderers in UK history. Both were just 14 years old when they planned and carried out a double murder. The victims were Kim's 49-year-old mum, Elizabeth Edwards, and her 13-year-old sister, Katie. And tragically, the murders didn't come completely out of nowhere. For years, there had been tension between Kim and her mum, stemming from jealousy of the relationship that Katie had with their mum. The difficulties reportedly stretched back to 2008 when Elizabeth struck Kim over an argument over the TV. Elizabeth later reported herself to social services, and both Kim and Katie were placed in care for several months before eventually returning home. Although the case was later closed, Elizabeth reportedly believed Kim had never truly forgiven her. As Kim grew older, the relationship continued to deteriorate. In early 2015, Elizabeth approached her GP seeking family therapy after discovering a suicide note. Later that year, professionals actually reported improvements in their relationship, but around the same time, Kim began a relationship with school friend Lucas Markham. Kim would later describe Lucas as the first person who truly listened to her. The pair quickly became inseparable. In October 2015, they ran away together and were eventually found 6 days later, sleeping rough in woodland in Spalding. Elizabeth strongly disapproved of their relationship, reportedly describing it as a time bomb waiting to go off. And in the weeks before her death, she had barred Lucas from entering the family home, forcing the pair to meet outside instead. Meanwhile, Kim's mental state continued to worsen. She later told psychiatrists that life had become like a living, walking hell, and in March 2016, she attempted to take her own life with an overdose of painkillers. Over the following weeks, the relationship between mother and daughter deteriorated even further. Then, on the 13th of April 2016, everything came to a head. According to Kim's account, an argument had taken place a few days prior, during which her mother allegedly told her she would end up like her dad, who had left when she was a toddler. Kim also claimed that she returned home to find that some of her belongings had been packed away and others had been given to Katie, leaving her feeling unwanted and pushed out of the family. Of course, these claims come solely from Kim, and Elizabeth was sadly never able to give her own version of events. What is known is that Kim and Lucas spent the following day discussing murder, eventually convincing themselves that it was the only solution. At around midnight on the 13th of April 2016, Lucas walked for around 30 minutes to the Edwards family home in Lincolnshire. When he arrived, he knocked on Kim's bedroom window to signal that he was there. Kim then helped him enter through a bathroom window after he had climbed onto the roof of a shed. Lucas had come armed with 4 knives. Once he was inside, he made his way to Elizabeth's bedroom. As she slept, Lucas stood over her and stabbed her in the neck, later claiming that he aimed for her voice box to prevent her from screaming and waking Kim's sister, Katie. He then smothered her with a pillow while Kim watched in the doorway. After checking for a pulse, Lucas confirmed that Elizabeth was dead. The original plan had been for Kim to then kill her younger sister herself, but when that moment came, she said she couldn't do it. So instead, Lucas agreed to carry out the second murder as well. He entered Katie's bedroom and used the same method. In total, Elizabeth suffered 8 stab wounds, and Katie suffered 2. The murders were shocking enough, but what happened afterwards was perhaps even more disturbing. After killing Kim's mum and younger sister, Kim and Lucas dragged a mattress downstairs, had sex, ate ice cream, and watched the film Twilight. They then remained in the house as though nothing had ever happened. As concern grew over Lucas's whereabouts, members of his family began searching for him. His aunt knocked on the door twice the next day, but neither of the teenagers answered. After, Lucas was reported missing, and police attended the property and eventually forced entry through a downstairs bathroom window. Inside, they found Kim and Lucas still inside the house, along with the bodies of Elizabeth and Katie. The pair were arrested around 36 hours after the murders. Then during the investigation, Kim made a series of chilling comments. She admitted that she had been excited about killing her mum and later said, "I was getting rid of the only problem I could see." She also stated, "I wanted revenge for the way she had treated me. I did not feel anything for my mum. She deserved it, and I'm glad she's dead. Psychiatrists who examined the teenagers described the couple's relationship as toxic. That Kim was not suffering from any recognized mental illness, but was instead struggling with feelings of rejection and a desire to belong. At trial, Lucas admitted murder. Kim denied murder, but admitted manslaughter, with her defense arguing that long-standing attachment issues and an adjustment disorder had impaired her judgment. But the jury rejected that argument. Both teenagers were ultimately found guilty of murder. The judge described the deaths of Elizabeth and Katie as cold, calculated, and callous killings. Initially, Kim and Lucas were each sentenced to a minimum of 20 years in prison, although those terms were later reduced to 17.5 years. Our next case is that of Michael Hamer, a 14-year-old schoolboy who carefully lured an 11-year-old fellow student into a trap. The victim was Joe Geeling, an 11-year-old boy from Bury who suffered from cystic fibrosis. Teachers described Joe as a shining star. He was popular among his classmates and known for his infectious personality. On the 1st of March 2006, Joe received what appeared to be a letter from his school's deputy head teacher. The letter stated that Michael Hamer had been chosen to be Joe's mentor and that an after-school meeting had been arranged between the two. It instructed Joe to go home with Michael after school that day. But something didn't feel right. Joe showed the letter to a teacher who was immediately suspicious and advised him to speak directly to the deputy head teacher. But due to a fire alarm, Joe never did. Instead, he left with Michael after school that day. When Joe failed to return home by around 5:30 that evening, his family raised the alarm and a search was launched. The following morning, at around 10:30, a search dog discovered Joe's body in a shallow grave in Whitehead Park. This discovery devastated the local community. As detectives began retracing Joe's final movements, several students reported seeing him leave school with Michael the previous day. Michael was subsequently removed from school and taken to a police station for questioning. Initially, he told police that Joe had simply come back to his house to charge his mobile phone. But investigators quickly realised that his account didn't make sense. Before long, Michael changed his story and admitted to killing Joe. He claimed that the attack had started after Joe refused to hand over a photograph of Michael's half-brother who had died from cancer. According to Michael, he lost control and attacked him. But police could find no evidence that this photograph had ever existed. What detectives did find, though, painted a very different picture. Inside Michael's home, investigators discovered 4 draft versions of the letter that had been sent to Joe. The letter had never came from the deputy head teacher. It had been created by Michael himself. They also found another letter, which prosecutors later argued revealed a sexual obsession with Joe, something that Michael never admitted to. At trial, the prosecution alleged that Michael had made a sexual advance towards Joe after bringing him back to his house. When Joe rejected him, called him gay, and threatened to tell other pupils at school, they say that Michael lashed out. What followed was described by the judge as a sustained and savage attack. Using a frying pan, Michael repeatedly struck Joe over the head until the handle eventually broke off. The attack left Joe with extensive injuries, including multiple bruises and a fractured eye socket. Michael then armed himself with 2 kitchen knives and stabbed Joe 16 times to the neck, face, and upper body. After the attack, he dragged Joe's body down the stairs and placed it in a wheelie bin. He then wheeled the bin to a nearby park where he dumped Joe's body and attempted to conceal it in a shallow grave under some twigs. Then when he returned home, Michael cleaned the blood from the carpet on the stairs and in his bedroom. Later, when his mum arrived home, she noticed red stains, but he told her it was caused by a leaking red pen. He then took a bath and finished his homework, which was ironically about the 10 Commandments. As investigators looked into Michael's background, they learned that he had struggled socially and had been subjected to bullying at school. He had reportedly been labelled a dead man after informing teachers about the bullying that he had experienced. Psychiatrists later concluded that Michael was suffering from an adjustment disorder at the time of the murder. However, that did not diminish the seriousness of what he had done. Michael Hamer was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Initially, he was given a term of 12 years before becoming eligible for parole, but that sentence was later increased to 15 years after the initial sentence was deemed too lenient. Despite serving many years in prison, Michael still remains behind bars today. Previous attempts to secure his release have been rejected after authorities concluded that he continues to pose a high risk to children and the wider public. Our next case is that of James Fairweather, a 15-year-old whose fascination with serial killers would ultimately lead to 2 random murders. What makes this case even more disturbing is that after the second killing, it would take police another 11 months to catch him. By that point, he was already searching for a third victim. James had developed an obsession with mass murderers and serial killers, particularly the Yorkshire Ripper. During the night of the 28th of March 2014, or the early hours of the following morning, James quietly climbed out of a living room window at his family home in Colchester, so he wouldn't wake his parents by using the front door. He put on gloves, armed himself with a knife, and headed out into the darkness. Sometime that night, he arrived at Castle Park. There, he came across 33-year-old James Atfield, also known as Jim. Jim was asleep on the ground after a heavy night of drinking. James walked over and began stabbing him. He first targeted Jim's stomach before continuing the attack to his head. Then, when he thought that someone was coming with a light, he quickly fled the scene. James washed the knife, threw it in a fast-flowing river, and later burned the clothes that he was wearing. At around 5:45 a.m, Jim was discovered by a member of the public. Despite suffering more than 100 stab wounds, Jim was still alive. Emergency services desperately tried to save him, but he later died from his injuries. The attack had been so severe that one of his eyes was protruding from its socket, a detail that investigators would later realise connected his second murder. Despite a major investigation, police couldn't identify who was responsible. Then, 3 months later, James killed again. On the 17th of June 2014, 31-year-old Nahid Almania was walking along Salary Brook Trail on her way to university. She was only a short distance from her accommodation when James approached her from behind and stabbed her in the lower back. According to his account, he then spun Nahid around, removed her sunglasses, and stabbed her in the eye. He then stabbed her in the other eye. After that, he launched into what prosecutors described as a frenzied attack before leaving her for dead. The injuries to Nahid's eyes caused direct damage to her brain. Once again, James disposed of the weapon by throwing it into a fast-flowing river. As police searched for Nahid's killer, James was actually interviewed as one of around 70 people with a history of knife-related offences. Just months before, he had been sentenced to a youth supervision order for the involvement in a robbery at knife point. It was just 3 days after receiving that sentence that he murdered Jim. During this questioning, James denied any knowledge of Nahid's murder and claimed that he had been at home at the time. With no evidence linking him to the attack, he was released. Another 11 months passed. Then on the 26th of May 2015, police received a call from a woman walking her dog along Salary Brook Trail, the same location where Nahid had been murdered. She reported a man acting suspiciously. At first, he had been standing by a bridge, and soon after, she saw him hiding in some bushes. When officers arrived, they approached the man and asked whether he was carrying anything that he shouldn't be, to which he calmly admitted that he had a knife. The man was, of course, James Fairweather. As well as carrying the knife, he was wearing gloves. But what he told officers next was even more shocking. James admitted that he had been waiting for a third victim, but claimed that there'd been nobody around. As officers questioned him further, he confessed to the murders of both Jim Atfield and Nahid Almania. He even provided a detailed reenactment of the attacks.
Then he goes, he's the one. Went up to him, stood over like that. I'm not helping that. So I stabbed him first there. And I've done it a few times. While I was doing that, my voices were laughing louder and louder.
James later claimed that he had been possessed by the devil and during those 11 months had heard voices ordering him to kill. During psychiatric assessments, he described what experts called some of the most violent and antisocial thoughts that they had ever encountered. He claimed the voices encouraged him to set fire to babies, expressed hatred towards prostitutes, telling him to remove their tongues. He also admitted feeling excited by fantasies of throwing acid into the face of a teacher who had angered him. Meanwhile, the families of Jim and Nahid were left trying to rebuild their lives. Jim Atfield, a dad of 5, was described as a fun-loving, pleasant and harmless man. Before his murder, he had just been coming to terms with a disability and a brain injury caused by a car accident 4 years earlier. His death also had a devastating impact on his family, with his mother later forced to give up work and sell the family home. Nahid's family were equally devastated. Her brother described her death as incomprehensible and said that she had been a warm, loving person who enjoyed spending time with her family. He had looked up to her throughout his life and considered her a role model. Prosecutors argued that James had intended to become a serial killer, just like those that he so admired. The murders were described as brutal and sadistic, and the judge concluded that his obsession with serial killers had undeniably fueled these killings. At trial, the defense argued that a combination of autism, paranoia, and the voices that James reported hearing had substantially impaired his responsibility, but the jury rejected that argument. James Fairweather was found guilty of murder. After receiving his sentence, he was reported to have mouthed the words, "I don't give a shit." He was sentenced to detention at Her Majesty's pleasure with a minimum term of 27 years. An appeal to reduce that sentence was dismissed in 2016, and even if he is ever released, he will remain on licence for the rest of his life. Our next case is that of William Cornick, a teenager who spent years fantasizing about murdering a teacher who, by all accounts, had done nothing to deserve his hatred. At first glance, William didn't fit the image that many people might have of a killer. Teachers described him as reserved but friendly, conscientious, and enthusiastic in school. He appeared polite, well-mannered, and got on reasonably well with those around him. But behind that outward appearance, something far darker was developing. Over time, friends began noticing an increasing level of anger, much of it directed towards one teacher in particular, 61-year-old Anne Maguire. But this anger appeared entirely irrational. Anne had never bullied William, disciplined him excessively, or treated him unfairly. Yet he became increasingly fixated on her. He began carrying a knife to school. By Christmas 2013, William's mum was aware that he had developed some sort of issue with Mrs. Maguire, but she had no idea just how serious it had become. And she certainly didn't know about the messages that he had been sending to his friends. Messages discussing his desire to brutally kill his teacher and spend the rest of his life in prison. Then came the 24th of April 2014. William would reveal that this was the day he effectively made his decision. Rather than taking his own life, something that he had also considered, he decided he would kill Anne Maguire instead. He weighed up different methods, including a gun, a blunt object, and even pushing her from a window. but he eventually settled on using a knife. Despite making that decision, those around him noticed nothing unusual. To teachers, he remained the same polite and seemingly ordinary teenager. But then 4 days later, on the morning of the 28th of April 2014, William arrived at Corpus Christi Catholic College in Leeds, carrying 2 knives in his bag. He also brought a bottle of Jack Daniel's whiskey, which prosecutors later said he would use to celebrate after carrying out his plan. Throughout the morning, William repeatedly told classmates that he was going to kill Mrs. Maguire. Some thought he was just joking, while others were concerned. But William threatened to kill them if they were to tell someone. He also spoke about plans to kill 2 other teachers, one of which was pregnant. According to evidence heard in court, William said he wanted to stab her in the stomach and kill her unborn child. What made these conversations even more disturbing was how excited he appeared. He wasn't nervous, he was looking forward to it. Later that morning, during a Spanish lesson, William showed some classmates the knives, winked, then got up out of his seat and walked towards Anne Maguire. At the time, she was standing at the front of the classroom, helping another student. William approached her from behind, and without warning, he started to stab her. Anne was just 5'2" and of slight build, while William stood around a foot taller. She attempted to escape, but William chased after her and continued the attack as she tried to flee. The screams quickly alerted other staff members. One teacher rushed from a nearby classroom after hearing the commotion and was met by panicked students in the corridor. She then saw Anne Maguire clutching the back of her neck, desperately trying to get away. The teacher pushed Anne into another classroom and held the door shut with her foot. Meanwhile, William simply returned to his seat as though nothing had ever happened. Witnesses later described him as eerily calm. One student even recalled him saying, "It's a pity she's not dead." He also reportedly announced to the class, "Good times." Meanwhile, Anne Maguire was fighting for her life. Paramedics rushed her to hospital, but during the journey, she stopped breathing. Anne Maguire never regained consciousness. Her injuries had been catastrophic. Anne had been stabbed 7 times to the neck and upper back. One wound passed completely through her lower neck, another severed a jugular vein, and she also suffered shattered ribs and a punctured lung. Pathologists later concluded that many of the wounds had been inflicted with severe force. As police investigated, they uncovered just how long William had been planning the attack. Messages recovered from his phone revealed that 2 months before the murder, he had sent a friend a message describing Anne Maguire as the one absolute fucking bitch that deserves more than death. Police also found images of knives stored on his phone. Eventually, William even admitted that the thoughts of killing Mrs. Maguire had been present for around 3 years, dating back to when he was in year 8. And perhaps more shocking of all was his complete lack of remorse. At one point he stated, "I couldn't give a shit. I wasn't in shock. I was happy. I had a sense of pride. I still do." At trial, William Cornick was convicted of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years. He can first be considered for release in 2034, although any release would also depend on authorities deciding that he no longer poses a risk to the public. For Anne Maguire's family, friends and former pupils, however, the loss can never be measured by a sentence. Anne had taught at the school for 4 decades and was widely respected by both colleagues and students. Former pupils described her as caring, kind, and someone who would do anything to help others. Some even said that she felt more like a friend than a teacher. Colleagues described her as wonderful and fantastic, and her family remembered her as a shining star who radiated happiness, positivity, and joy. Our next case is that of Sharon Carr, a girl who would later become known in the media as the Devil's Daughter. In the early hours of the 7th of June 1992, 18-year-old apprentice hairdresser Katie Ratcliffe was walking home after a night out at Ragamuffins nightclub in Surrey, but she never made it home. Later that morning, a group of boys made a horrifying discovery near a cemetery wall in Farnborough. There, they found Katie's body, stabbed to death and sexually mutilated. The attack had been extraordinarily violent. Katie had been stabbed 32 times with a 6.5-inch kitchen knife. Some of the wounds had penetrated through her rib cage and into her heart, while others had been inflicted in intimate areas of her body, and jewellery had also been taken from Katie. Investigators quickly noticed the brutality of this murder. Katie's clothing had also been disturbed, leaving police to believe that the attack may have had a sexual motive. However, there was no evidence of a sexual assault. Because of the nature of the injuries, detectives became convinced that they were looking for an adult male offender, and as a result, the case remained unsolved for almost 2 years. Then, on the second anniversary of Katie's murder, a fellow female pupil was attacked at Collingwood College in Camberley. Without any apparent motive, Sharon Carr stabbed the student in the school toilets. The victim was stabbed in the back, suffering a punctured lung. Fortunately, 5 students entered the toilet and intervened before the attack could become even more serious. The victim told investigators that Sharon appeared happy during the assault and was smiling as it happened. That night, Sharon didn't return home. Instead, she was found the following morning within the school grounds and was arrested. As police began questioning, a deeply disturbing picture emerged. Sharon had long been obsessed with death and violence. She reportedly spoke about harming animals, admitting she enjoyed stabbing cats, and claimed to have beheaded a dog with a spade. Then, while being held at an assessment centre, her violence continued when she attempted to strangle 2 female staff members. But while awaiting trial, she was bragging about a crime that authorities had no idea that she had committed. She was heard on the phone bragging to friends and family about murdering Katie Radcliffe 2 years prior. And notes were also discovered in her diary which showed sexual excitement over Katie's death. One page read, "If only I could kill you again, I promise I would make you suffer more this time, you fucking slag. Your terrified screams turned me on." When questioned, Sharon confessed in disturbing detail. She described details of Katie's injuries that police had deliberately withheld from the public, and she also knew about a stolen bracelet, information that only the killer would have known. During a reenactment of the murder, investigators were shocked when Sharon reportedly laughed as she demonstrated what had happened. Sharon had also claimed that 2 boys had been with her on the night of Katie's murder, alleging that they helped transport Katie's body. However, neither of the 2 stood trial after providing alibis for one another. At the age of just 17, Sharon was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 14 years. As she was led from the dock, she reportedly smiled. Yet, despite becoming eligible for release in 2011, Sharon still remains behind bars today. Over the years, she has repeatedly attacked prison staff and fellow inmates and regularly expressed a desire to kill. She was briefly transferred to HMP Lord Newton in County Durham, but was later moved back to Bronzefield after attacking another inmate. Sharon was just recently denied parole in August 2023. Often referred to in the media as the Devil's Daughter, Sharon remains the youngest female to have been convicted of a single murder in British history, when she committed her crime at just 12 years old. More than 3 decades later, authorities still believe she remains too dangerous to release. We'll finish with perhaps the most infamous female child killer in British history, Mary Bell. While Sharon Carr is described as the youngest female murderer in the UK, Mary holds a slightly different distinction. At just 11 years old, she became the youngest girl in Britain to be convicted over the deaths of 2 children. However, unlike Sharon, Mary was convicted of manslaughter rather than murder, due to diminished responsibility. To understand this case, let's take a look at Mary's childhood. According to relatives, she was an unwanted and neglected child from the moment she was born. Family members recalled that after giving birth, Mary's mum reportedly shouted at hospital staff to "take the thing away from me" when they attempted to place the baby in her arms. As Mary grew up, concerns about her welfare only continued. Relatives believed that her mum either neglected her or actively tried to harm her. On one occasion, Mary was reportedly dropped from a first-floor window. She was also allegedly given sleeping tablets and exposed to serious abuse throughout her childhood. But despite concerns from her family members, Mary remained in her mum's care. As she grew older, she began displaying troubling behaviour herself. She was known for unpredictable mood swings and had reportedly attempted to strangle or suffocate other children during arguments and fights. Then, in May 1968, a series of incidents began to attract police attention. On the 11th of May, a 3-year-old boy was found dazed, bleeding, and wandering around Scotswood in Newcastle. The child later told adults that he had been playing with Mary Bell and her friend Norma Bell. Despite sharing a surname, the two girls were not related. The boy claimed that one of the two girls had pushed him from the roof of a disused air raid shelter. That same evening, police also received reports that 3 young girls had been assaulted in a sandpit and that one of the attackers had attempted to strangle them. When questioned, Mary denied the allegations. Norma, however, claimed that Mary had tried to throttle the girls. Because of their ages, no further action was taken. Then, just 2 weeks later, on the 25th of May 1968, the day before Mary's 11th birthday, 4-year-old Martin Brown was found dead in an upstairs room of a derelict building. Martin had been strangled. This discovery shocked the local community. The following day, which happened to be Mary's birthday, the two girls broke into a local nursery and caused extensive damage. During the investigation, police discovered several handwritten notes, apparently confessing to Martin's death. But officers dismissed them at the time as tasteless and childish pranks. In the days that followed, Mary even visited Martin's family home and asked if she could see him. When his mum explained that Martin was dead, Mary reportedly replied that she wanted to see him in his coffin. Then 2 months later, another child disappeared. On the 31st of July 1968, 3-year-old Brian Howe was playing outside his home with other children. Among those present were Mary and Norma. When Brian failed to return home, relatives and neighbours began searching for him. At 11:10 that night, his body was found between 2 large concrete blocks. Brian had also been strangled. His hair had been cut, his body had been mutilated, and an attempt had been made to carve the letter M into his tummy. The nature of the injuries led investigators to suspect that the killer might actually be a child. More than 100 detectives were assigned to the case, and over 1,200 children were interviewed. Eventually, Mary revealed more than she intended. During questioning, she mentioned details involving a pair of damaged scissors found near Brian's body. The problem was that police had never released that information publicly. Days later, Norma's parents contacted police and said that their daughter wanted to tell them what she knew. Norma claimed that Mary had taken her to Brian's body, demonstrated how she had strangled him, and admitted enjoying killing him. Mary was arrested. According to reports, her response was simply, "That's all right by me." Norma was also arrested, but she strongly denied any involvement. As the investigation continued, Mary admitted responsibility for Martin Brown's death, but placed the blame for Brian Howe's murder on Norma. The two girls would ultimately stand trial together. During proceedings, Norma's mother testified that she and her partner had once caught Mary attempting to strangle Norma's younger sister and that she had only let go after Norma's father physically intervened. The judge later concluded that Mary's actions had been carried out solely for the pleasure and excitement of a killing. Mary Bell was found not guilty of murder, but convicted of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility after she'd been diagnosed with a psychopathic personality disorder. She was sentenced to detention at Her Majesty's pleasure, and at the time, no minimum term existed for minors, so her sentence was indefinite. Upon hearing the verdict, Mary burst into tears. Norma Bell was acquitted of all charges. In 1977, Mary briefly escaped from an open prison with another inmate before being recaptured several days later in Blackpool. Finally, in May 1980, at the age of 23, Mary was released after serving around 11.5 years. She was granted lifelong anonymity and has lived under a new identity ever since.